Hi, and welcome back to our reading of The Red Lion by Maria Szepes. So last reading we finished chapter 29, which was the end of our hero's dad's telling of the fairy tale of Princess Belshazzar, which is very heavy in its symbolism and its mysticism and all that. And which is going to be a foundation for what our hero learns and experiences in the rest of this incarnation. And in today's reading, we're going into chapter 30, which is called He Who Never Dies. And He Who Never Dies, in this case, is the famous and mystical character of the Count of Saint Germain. And many people who have studied, the inner teachings, mysticism, the path, various teachings have come in contact with the stories about Saint Germain in one way or another. My first encounter was through the teachings of the Summit Lighthouse, and there's a prayer that he inspired through the messenger Elizabeth Clare Prophet, which is called I Am the Light of the Heart. I've always wanted to sing it. I've never had a melody, and I'm going to try. We'll see. It's a really nice prayer. Of the heart, shining in the darkness of being. I am the light of the heart, shining in the darkness of being, changing all into the golden treasury of the mind of Christ. I am projecting my love out into the world. I am projecting my love out into the world to erase all errors and to break down all barriers. I am the power of infinite love. I am the power of infinite love, amplifying itself until it is victorious. World without end. All right, thank you. That's the second time I've sang that one through. He Who Never Dies, Chapter 30. When I was 18, I was made a practitioner, the third grade of the order. The laboratory work I began to perform under my father's guidance was completely new and entertaining. During those quiet, absorbed hours, I learned the true characteristics of nature and the great laws of the divine life force that worked behind them. Poor blind Borges, he had simply played with these phenomena like a child playing with dynamite. And all the vast knowledge of homunculus was miserably small beside the knowledge of a single functioning cell, for it is filled with life's secret and performs a transmutation every second. The members of my order have been variously called Rosicrucians, Templars, and Trinosophians, but in essence the order was simply a continuation of those ancient communities which guarded the traditions of the most profound philosophy. The school of Pythagoras performed this sacred chore to the same extent as did the Essenes of Judea, among whom Jesus prepared himself for his mission. I have intentionally omitted the Masonic Lodge from this group, for it has deviated into worldly affairs. In the 18th century, the centers of the order were the castle of Karl von Hesse and the mystical school in Louisenland in Schleswig. Its leader was the Count Saint Germain, a friend of Karl von Hesse, who was revered by the brotherhood, misunderstood and admired by the nobility, and execrated by the masses, who referred to him as the man who has never died. He was the quintessential wizard, scientist, and artist, the magus. He had been the eyewitness of millennia, this enigmatic emissary of the secret brotherhood. The Hermetic order itself was basically Egyptian in origin, but it also embodied the Christian mysticism of Christian Rosenkreuz. This Rosenkreuz had been born in 1388 into the German nobility and reared in a monastery. During a pilgrimage in the Holy Land, he was initiated into the mysteries of the secret sciences by some erudite Arabs in Damascus. After 3 years in Damascus, he went to Fez in Africa, where he learned more about magic and the relationship of the macrocosmos and the microcosmos. Then he returned to Germany by way of Spain. Once home, he founded the monastery community of Sanctus Spiritus, where he retired to continue his studies. Later, he accepted some of the monks from the monastery where he had been reared as disciples and thus formed the first Rosicrucian society. These monks wrote the results of their researches in books still available to Rosicrucians today. Rosenkreuz's tomb wasn't discovered until 120 years after his death. It was an underground vault, reached by a staircase, and there was an inscription on the door that read, Post annos cxs patebo. Inside the vault, a light was burning, but it was extinguished the moment someone entered. The vault had 7 sides and 7 corners, and each side was 5 feet long and 8 feet high. The ceiling, which symbolized heaven, was quartered in triangles. The floor symbolized the earth. In the midst of the mystic chamber was an altar. There was a copper plate on it engraved with the initials ACRC, and chiseled below it were the words Hoc Universi Compendium Vivis Mihi Sepulchrum Feci. 4 figures surrounded this altar. Each of them was inscribed, and the inscriptions taken together read, Nequam vacum, legis jugum, libertas evangelii, Dei gloria intacta. Rosenkreuz's body was under the altar. It showed no signs of decay. His hand held a scroll on which an illuminated T was visible. The members of the Rosicrucian order took a vow of secrecy about this matter. Really, Rosenkreuz was fulfilling a mission and doing the work of his distant masters who saw that the time was ripe to establish spiritual embassies. Today, the history of the Fraternitas Rosa Crucis is well enough known not to require further discussion. Saint Germain, however, was more conjectural. The public part of his life was so astonishing, and his personality so fascinating and unusual that the average person could not understand him. He had traveled widely, was wealthy without visible means of support, and had a penetrating intellect. These things all aroused suspicion. People who had to have a label for everybody called him an impostor, but no one ever caught him in a swindle. Instead, he was highly esteemed by rulers, philosophers, scientists, and artists. I was 20 when Saint Germain paid an unexpected visit to the castle of Grotte. I had heard a good deal about him, of course, and I had been granted entry to the secret place that housed his famous occult library and rare manuscripts. His secular friends also knew about this library, and they tried without success to find it after his supposed death. I had also seen his paintings, whose colors were mixed so brilliantly they dazzled the viewer. It was a well-known fact that the French painter Van Loo had asked to learn the secret of this mixture and had been refused. And I knew that Saint Germain was in the habit of giving violin concerts, conducting symphonies without the score, and composing both lieder and operas. Many of the powerful personalities who knew Saint Germain, Frederick the Great, Voltaire, Madame de Pompadour, Rousseau, the Earl of Chatham, and Sir Robert Walpole, had tried to find out something about his origins. The most common theory was that he was the son of Rákóczi, the Prince of Transylvania. Later, the Theosophists declared that he was Ferenc Rákóczi himself and that someone else had been buried in the great man's place. Other people believed that he had appeared in various countries under different names: the Marquis de Montferrat in Venice, Chevalier Schwening in Pisa, Chevalier Weldon in Milan and Leipzig, Comte de Soltikow in Genoa and Leghorn, Graf Zaroghi in Schwalbach and Triesdorf, Rákóczi in Dresden, and Saint Germain in Paris, The Hague, and St. Petersburg. Some of the mystic writers connected him with the mysterious Comte de Gabalet, who came to the Abbé Villiers and gave him some essays on submundane spirits. Others were sure he was the Signor Gualdi of whom Hargrave Jennings had written in his book on the Rosicrucians. They also suspected that he was really Count Hompesch, the last Grand Master of the Knights of Malta. All of this was understandable in view of Saint Germain's widely varied life, but it is certain that he was not really all the people he was alleged to have been. In those days, the world was still a huge place, and more than one adventurer, countries away from the original, took advantage of the prestige of his glistening personality. The same thing happened to another initiate, Count Cagliostro, a man of noble aspirations who became completely fused in the popular mind with the charlatan Joseph Balsamo. I myself obtained evidence that Cagliostro and Balsamo were two different men with widely disparate personalities. But anyone who thought the multifaceted Count Saint Germain was simply an adventurer out for material gain was thoroughly mistaken. He owned in his own right an unrivaled collection of paintings and precious stones, and Madame de Pompadour testified that he gave the king valuable Velázquez's and Murillos and presented her with the rarest and most valuable of her gems. For he was always the patron, never the patronized. He never betrayed confidence, yet no one was ever able to determine the origin or extent of his wealth. He had no connections with any of the great banking houses, but he appeared to have unlimited credit. Currently, Saint Germain was friendly with Louis XV, whose whole court was fascinated by his knowledge of chemistry. At Louis's request, he would remove flaws from diamonds and rubies right in front of everyone. He also achieved astonishing results in coloring precious stones with his own mixture of paint and crushed mother of pearl. The king lavished him with favors, and he virtually turned the court upside down, bringing a new excitement and freshness to the rigid aristocracy. People began to look for miracles everywhere and could talk of nothing but alchemy and the occult and Saint Germain's strange sayings. The Count had a perfect knowledge of history that went back thousands of years. He talked about events at the court of Francis I as though he had been there himself, giving an intimate description of that king and even imitating his voice and manner. Furthermore, he could give just as many confidential details about Babylon during the reign of Cyrus the Great. Naturally, he dumbfounded people. Some branded him a compulsive liar and a sensation-seeking charlatan, but even they had to admit that his facts were always accurate and were presented naturally rather than being introduced artificially. Saint Germain had the genius to comprehend the entire European situation at any given time. He parried his political enemies with the greatest of ease. The Count always seemed to have letters or recommendation that opened the highest doors in Europe. He had lived in Russia during the reign of Peter the Great, and he had been the honored guest of the Shah of Persia between 1737 and 1742. It appeared he was known and respected all over the globe. And beyond all this, Saint Germain had a supernatural command of languages. He could speak German, English, Italian, Portuguese, Spanish, Arabic, French, Greek, Latin, and Chinese so fluently that he was accepted as a native in all these countries. Only his French was slightly accented. He spoke it as do the Piedmontese. He was ambidextrous and could write the same text simultaneously with each hand, or a different text with each. Sometimes he wrote a sonnet and a mystic poem both at once. Saint Germain had performed public transmutations twice, and people always flocked to get his rejuvenating elixirs and medicines. Frankly, I didn't like what I heard. Undoubtedly, he had the extraordinary abilities that should belong to a real magus and initiate, but why did he display them so openly, almost blatantly? Why the dazzling fortune and the 2 valets and 4 lackeys in cream and gold lace livery? Why should an adept have a wardrobe like a courtesan, fresh jewels for every week and a new name for every year? I voiced my doubts to my father, and he smiled. Saint Germain doesn't need those trappings any more than you or I. His real home is the hermitage in the Himalayas from which he came and to which he will return when he has completed the mission assigned him by the higher forces. I myself can swear that he never eats at the rich tables to which he is invited. He eats a meager, meatless diet that is prepared to his own recipe. Every morning he does esoteric Oriental concentration and meditation exercises without fail. And he refrains from having intimate relations with women. Since he can make stones into gems and base metal into gold, it is easy enough for him to put on this character which the world accepts more readily than the yellow robe and the shaven head. Those diverse abilities are nothing but the toys like a doctor uses to captivate a sick child while he examines its ills, slips a dose of bitter medicine into its mouth, or cuts out a dangerous abscess. You know yourself that this sick, fermenting world that has deviated so completely from the source of all spiritual health would never understand the magus in its true form. Our sophisticated monomaniac universe is drifting toward a crisis, and Saint Germain has been sent out into a quaking world already facing a grim sunset to establish first aid stations for souls. But the things he must do to attract their attention, they are so blinded and deafened by matter that he must ring all the bells and show them marvelous colors and phenomena. He has to be a king among kings, a Croesus among the rich, and a magus among philosophers. He has to understand everyone's tongue, see through everyone's eyes, and at the same time hear the secret voices behind the visible actions. He even has to penetrate walls, my father concluded with a sigh. I asked, but who is he really? How long has he lived in one body? My father gave me a gentle, understanding glance. I asked Saint Germain the same questions many years ago when I was a practitioner. What was his answer? He said the secret science was his father and the mysteries his mother. Did that satisfy you? I was disappointed. Not then, but later I realized that that is all a true adept can ever say about himself. One evening I went into my father's study just as it was growing dark. I had been in the park all afternoon practicing my nature and symbol understanding exercises. The creek hurried along under the old trees there, and I had collected from its bed strangely colored, polished pebbles whose delicate, translucent bodies were veined with lines like ancient hieroglyphs. These lines were mute screams of pain and yearning. You only had to read them. I had also spent some time watching a teeming anthill near a huge linden tree. The ants scurried to and fro about the base of the trunk. This was a real ant metropolis, totally absorbed in its industrious, fascinating work. Yet the little insects were prisoners of their communal instinct. Watching them, I realized that the experiment of collectivism must always be a fiasco. It locks itself into a circular cage of slavery to achieve the outward appearance of liberation, sustaining a lifestyle that leads nowhere. The society grinds without seeds, makes strenuous efforts with no meaning, refines its operations to masterly precision, all going nowhere, until the fragmented group consciousness rouses itself to break out of the swirling hell of this ingenious and terrible society and forms into unique, self-aware individuals. This September evening, as always, I reported my results to my father, putting my prize pebbles on his desk. He had just finished writing and was waiting for me. He listened to my observations and then added his own remarks, which often helped me to get the entire thought complexes into focus. When he had finished, I got up to leave and prepare for supper, but he restrained me. "Wait. We've got a visitor." "A visitor?" I was surprised. So far as I knew, we'd had neither letter nor messenger that day. "Who is it?" The room had grown dark. Suddenly I felt a presence that had not been there moments earlier. My father also felt this, for he stood up. Following his gaze, I turned around. The newcomer stood in the glimmering grey rectangle of the window. Now he came forward. "Perhaps we might light the lamp now, Cornelius." He had a pleasant voice and his speech was polished and attractive. "Welcome!" My father shook his hand with real joy. Then I knew who the man was, and I felt a sudden stage fright that made me remain motionless while my father did the work of lighting the lamp. As the blue-white light poured through the room, Saint Germain came over to me. "So this is he," he said, giving my father a friendly nod. Then the pressure of his strong, dry hand put me at ease. "At last, but not for the first time. Good evening," he said softly, staring into my eyes. "Good evening." I returned his greeting, relaxed now and unself-conscious. I stared at this mysterious man. It was not the first time I had seen him. The memory of him slumbered deep within me. At last, but not for the first time. Oh yes, he knew. He knew where it was that we had met in the dim, distant past. Only the shadow of remembrance brushed me. The man's eyes were dark and gentle, but there was intelligence and mystery there too. They seemed to see and understand everything. His face was oblong with a delicate, slightly curved nose and a mouth where smiles seemed to lie in waiting. When he did smile, an expression of pure joy transfigured his face. For the rest, he had a slight tan and black hair and was wearing a simple, if finely woven suit on his medium frame. I couldn't begin to estimate his age. It was unusual that I was able to meet him, for generally the lower grades of the order were not allowed to get acquainted with those on the higher levels, except for the immediate next grade. There were 9 grades in all: juniors, theoreticians, practitioners, philosophers, minors, majors, adeptus, exemptus, magisters, and finally the magi. There were a good many members of the lower grades. Membership diminished in proportion to the difficulty of the grade. Of course, the ultimate rung on this ladder was God. He stood in the position of 10. This represents the duality. God equals 1, world equals 0. But my situation had been exceptional from birth. My father, who was my master and had directed me from my earliest exercises, was already a magister, the second highest rank. No one ever called Saint Germain by his secular name, even when he made unexpected appearances at the order's meetings in Wittenberg. Each member of the order had a fraternal name different from the one by which he was generally known, and his secular name was never used. Saint Germain's fraternal name was Tempio Aperto, open temple. When he conducted the secret initiation ceremonies, he was called Hierophant. Of course, The exceptional opportunity to meet him was not a divine grace that had fallen into my lap. I had worked for this privilege once upon a time. I remembered it gradually later during the silence of initiation. I had actually been a member of the fraternity for many centuries before my fall and had gotten as far as the threshold of the final trials. But my talent, intellect, and discipline had been only on a human order, and during the convulsive crisis of conscious death and rebirth, I had yielded to my weaknesses, fears caused by imperfect knowledge and passion caused by unresolved emotions. Still, my ideals had ever been high, and I really understood a good deal of the theory of sacred symbols and the truths of existence. My return had been a genuine joy to my fellow members and the Magi, who had never ceased to regard me as a member. Really, my lapse, in spite of all the misery it had cost me, was simply a practical test of a tenet of faith laid down during my mystical initiation. I had had to learn and understand it thoroughly and make it real part of me, despite the tangling chaos of material unreality. Initiation always occurs twice. The first time is when an entity has come to Earth but still has an undimmed awareness of the other world. Then he steps into the Temple of Mysteries. During the trials, he is alone in the silence of condensed time and shrunken space, and an indelible sketch is etched upon his soul in a few sure marks. The trials themselves are symbols of all the temptations, possibilities, and dangers to be undergone later, and of the true meaning of existence. This sketch, once made, is guarded by the soul, and its lines are still visible through the thickest body dress, even though their meaning has been forgotten. It is the burning urge that appears in our restless dreams and drives us to and fro from experience to experience in the barricaded physical world. It is the source of the eternal discontent that causes us to reach forward for ephemeral goals. For behind these goals is this chimera, the sacred riddle that lures us on even through the midst of passion, ambition, intellectual attainments, death, and birth. No matter how far we stray, we are still on the prescribed path and will return to our beginnings. Then there is the second final initiation that takes place at the end of the road, after the fires of passion are burned out and human experience has been endured. The theory becomes a living reality, and the gate of the first mystery swings open. But once you have passed the first gate, you cannot leave until you have trod the entire maze. Saint Germain's arrival caused a real change in my life, for my father told me I was to accompany the Count to Paris. I could tell he was watching intently to see how I would react. Would I reveal joy, immature excitement, or anxiety? I confronted myself honestly, facing the ashes of dead fires the name conjured in me. I knew that I must go where I was sent, that every course set before me was a part of my personal task. Knowing this, I submitted obediently. What will my duties be in Paris? I asked quietly. You are to be the Count's secretary and famulus, to learn from him and obey his instructions. How long will I be in this post? I suddenly felt sad at the thought of leaving my parents and this beautiful, peaceful park where I had spent so many wonderful days. Until your work is finished. My father was firm. I was ashamed of having been so immature. My mother came up to me, encouragement in her every feature. I embraced her. Distance means nothing to the soul, she whispered. You have to check your knowledge before every important examination, you know. Go in peace, Cornelius. And that is the end of chapter 30. Thank you very much, And we'll continue on with Cornelius's adventures with Saint Germain in the next reading.